Before colonisation, every now and then the river would flood, and it would bring from the Yarra catchment, all this beautiful nutrients from the forests and so on, and they'd almost like fertilise the delta of the Yarra River. So it was an incredibly rich place, and those floods were highly productive. But after colonisation, the floods became a real issue for the early settlement, and some of the early floods were vastly destructive. So whenever there's a high tide and there's heavy rainfall, and those two things coincide, you can just be sure that it will flood in Montague, and that continues until today.
I guess I was a little bit surprised and maybe even a little sceptical. I mean, a piece of roof as a sculpture, that's art and science. It was a little bit far-fetched, but when you really delve into it and I started to see the sketches, it started to unfold the very intricacy and the significance of this work.
There's Melbourne soaring up, and here's this humble little piece of an old-fashioned house. It just speaks to its surroundings in contrast.
Before this statue, I had no idea about the floods, but now that it's there, I know so much more about it.
This is where the past really comes through into the present.
Wonderment Walk's mission statement is to create open-air galleries combining art and science to enable a conversation to start. The more you look at Ian's work, the more the purpose becomes obvious. We're talking about an area which is developing into high-rise apartments. So I think it's pretty significant to have a roof line which demonstrates the architecture of what was there.
Montague has a really interesting history. I think one of my favourite things from the research was finding the photos of the floods and seeing kids floating down the street on doors and playing in the floods as well. It was always really very polluted and really covered in this sort of black coal, and then so during these floods the waterlines would rise up and actually leave these black markings on houses and buildings as well. And so it became a huge inspiration. And then also starting to think about this architectural idea and this environmental idea of the 1 in 100 year flood.
So the 1 in 100 year flood is an interesting concept because all of our cities are basically based around this. The scientists get together and the water engineers, and they map how often floods happen, how frequently, how big they are, then the sort of stream heights and the stream shapes. And so the 1 in 100 year flood is actually not a flood that occurs once in every 100 years. It's actually a flood that has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. Planners use the 1 in 100 year flood level to determine where development can take place. And they do that because it's a cost-benefit analysis. If a flood happens, then there's a cost to cleaning up, and they decide that that's a cost that they can bear, about once in 100 years.
So the sculpture itself is based on a series of cuts taken out of timber-framed homes, workers' cottage homes, and so really replicates a lot of the tropes of those early workers' homes in the area. So then that house section was then taken, it was then cast, working and collaborating with Sculpt Studio and UAP in Queensland, and that was created a large 1-for-1 mould. What I really wanted is for you to be able to go up to this sculpture and see the texture and see the history and understand that they were like real weatherboards and real sections of house. That little section with a 5mm gap running along with a black marking comes right up exactly to the 1 in 100 year waterline mark. So if you actually look across that black mark line, you can see that all the buildings and the rest of the area have actually been built right up to that line. The best things about creating work like this is that it's actually not just a sculpture that's going to sit there in a static way, that it's actually been working with Wonderment Walk built into the school curriculum.
Sometimes it could be a bit bland just sitting in a classroom listening to a teacher tell you things like, oh, this happened, that happened. The art gives it a bit more pop into it. And I also think it's really good to have statues like this around, just so ordinary people like us can learn about what happened and why that statue's there.
If we don't know the past, then you can't really understand how things have like changed over the years.
This is really a monument to, you know, I hesitate to use the word ordinary, but, you know, people whose lives have not been celebrated in any way. And so I think that's very, very important.
Public art is a real opportunity for people to stop and consider their surroundings. And it acts as a mirror to us, and it gives us the opportunity to think, well, do I like what I see in the mirror?
I'd like people to think about Wonderment Walk Victoria as an ongoing story. It is a walk, it is sculpture, but the most important thing is to bring the community along for this discussion. And it's not just a physical walk, it's also an emotional, mental walk that we have to understand and appreciate what will improve the quality of our life here in Victoria, and science and art is central to that.